Of course, there would be no tale had there been no Taliesin. It is a legend about one of the founding fathers of the Welsh Bardic tradition, the historical Taliesin, who lived during the last half of the 6th century. Unfortunately, most of what we can say about him is pure conjecture, based as it is on various modern readings of archaic poetry. But in bringing together these frayed threads of history, we can at least guess at what the ancient tapestry once looked like. He lived at a time just after a dramatic shift in the Celtic culture of Britain, when the Welsh language had just evolved out of the earlier Brythonic tongue that had been spoken on the island for a millennium or more. In the year 410 of the Common Era, over a century before Taliesin's birth, Roman control of Britain ended when the last officials of the empire were apparently expelled. Britain descended into further turmoil as different invaders sought to capture territory from the early Welsh, whose ancestors had inhabited the island for at least 2,000 years before the Romans had arrived. During the remaining decades of the 400s, Germanic chiefs increased their small foothold on the southern and eastern shores. Picts continued their raiding from the north and the Irish from the west. And in the middle of it all, the early Welsh kingdoms were still trying to find their feet in the vacuum left by the collapsing Roman Empire. It was under these pressures that Cymraeg, Welsh, evolved, perhaps developing alongside a revitalised identity for the ancient Brythonic people who would now come to call themselves Cymru, the native inhabitants of Britain. The first half of the 500s was just as unsettled, and Taliesin was born into a time when the Welsh and Germanic tribes were fighting it out over who would be dominant south of Hadrian's Wall. The first mention we have of Taliesin in the historical record is in the Historia Brittonum, a brief account of British history written in Latin in 828 of the Common Era. In an early entry for the middle of the 6th century, it tells us, "Then Talheiarn, father of Awen, and Neirin and Taliesin, and Blwchfardd and Cian, who is called Gwenith Gwawd, together at the same time were renowned in British poetry." British here, of course, means the early Welsh. The shift in language that followed the departure of the Romans may have not only revitalised the Brythonic identity, but also the ancient bardic tradition of these Celtic people. Talheiarn, the first poet mentioned in the list, is called the father of Awen, and this may simply have been a sign of his own sense of grandeur, or perhaps it was a more meaningful title. Was he the founder of a new bardic order? The father of a new lineage in the native arts? The Tal that makes up the first part of his name is of course the same Tal that we find in Taliesin. But whereas Talheiarn means iron brow, Taliesin means shining or radiant brow. Although an explicit reason is given for the meaning of Taliesin's name in the later folk tale, was it originally regarding some type of metalwork worn on the head? The idea of an iron four-headed bard and a shining four-headed bard in the same generation is suggestive. Or is this referring to a spiritual light shining from the brow? Not that dissimilar to a saint's halo. A similar light is described elsewhere in the Celtic tradition, in the story of the death of Cuchulainn. There is at least a connection between the names of these two bards, Talheiarn being the father of Awen, and Taliesin, one of the better-known bards of a new generation working in an ancient tradition. Modern scholarship has generally accepted, although not unanimously, 12 early Welsh poems as the work of the historical Taliesin, even though they appear to have been copied down in the 9th century. One theory is that the original core of these 12 poems may well have been composed by the 6th century Taliesin and was then preserved in the oral tradition of the Welsh bards. As a result, these poems would have slowly evolved by being reworked and updated by successive generations, and finally written down in the 9th or 10th centuries. Taking for granted that these 12 poems are at least close to the work of the 6th century Taliesin, a rough outline of his life was suggested by the editor of these poems, Sir Ifor Williams. According to Sir Ifor, Taliesin was probably born somewhere in mid-Wales during the first half of the 6th century, and would have served his apprenticeship under the tutelage of a pencerdd, or chief of the Bardic craft. As part of his training, he would have memorised many poems, stories, histories and lore, and trained in the specialised techniques of Welsh bardic poetry. The most important part of his education would have involved learning how to compose and perform praise poetry for the Welsh nobility. He probably spent his early career praising the local chieftains of Powys before advancing to praise the higher-ranking nobility. If there is any truth in the account given by Ellis Griffith of Taliesin's youth, he may have been a precocious young talent who visited the court of the historical Maelgwn Gwynedd. Traditionally, Maelgwn's chief court was at Deganwy and overlooked the Conwy estuary on the coast of North Wales, but he's also connected with several places across the country, including Traeth Maelgwn, Maelgwn's beach, in the Dyfi estuary just north of Barth, where in one version of the folktale, the as yet unnamed Taliesin washes ashore. One tradition tells of how Maelgwn finally succumbed to a yellow fever, almost certainly the Justinian plague, in 547 of the Common Era, while trying to isolate himself in a church. If any of that is reliable, then Taliesin could have been born in the 520s or 530s. If he was in training as a young apprentice bard at this time, it's quite possible his pencerdd took him along on a visit to a great king's court. High-ranking bards often visited the courts of important kings with apprentices in tow, either while on circuit throughout the land, or perhaps on some formal business on behalf of another king. It's at the court of another Welsh king that Taliesin may have begun his official career. Sir Ifor Williams suggested that perhaps the earliest of Taliesin's poems to have survived was composed for Cynan Garwyn, the king of Powys. According to the poem, Cynan had given generous patronage to the young bard. 100 horses as fast as each other with silver harnesses, 100 purple cloaks, each as broad as the other, 100 bracelets for my arms, 50 expensive ornaments. For such a price, a young poet was likely to say anything that would make his king happy. We know little about Cynan's actual military career, but the poem mentions victories against the men of Gwent, Morn and Dyfed. All of these battles were against other significant Welsh powers of the day, but no mention is ever made of the ascendant power of the Saxons to the east, nor the Angles to the northeast. This may have been a period of truce or even collaboration. Plenty of later Welsh kings whose territories bordered those of the invaders had no issue with making alliances if they aligned with their own interests. But neither is any mention made of Rheged, the Welsh kingdom of yr Hen Ogledd, the Old North. The one poem we have in praise of Cynan is silent about the only other Welsh power worth mentioning at this time. We can only guess at why Taliesin left Cynan's court in Powys and travelled north. The bard may have found the king's reluctance to fight the Saxons, the most significant threat of the age, an issue, made even more distasteful because Cynan instead made gains by attacking his own people. Not that Cynan was in any way unique in his attacks on other Welsh kingdoms. All the tribal powers of post-Roman Britain were in a long and permanent state of conflict with each other, regardless of ethnicity. But a trained bard like Taliesin would have appreciated the history and ethnic unity of the Welsh as one people, and therefore perhaps a greater sensitivity to the very obvious impending danger from the east. The Welsh had lost significant territories over the preceding century and continue to do so at an alarming rate throughout the 500s. That historical reality may have cast Cynan in a rather unfavourable light, and Taliesin may not have wished to be damned by association. Another reason may well have been that the young bard simply didn't think Cynan would ever really make anything of himself. And if Taliesin was to fulfil his ambition of creating a poetry that would sing down the ages, the dream of every aspiring bard, he needed an object of praise that could inspire him to reach such lofty heights. He may have realised he needed to attach himself to a man of greater vision. There are many reasons a young bard such as Taliesin may have headed for Urien and the kingdom of Rheged. The only certainty is that the exercise of his bardic art would have been central to his decision. Someone who had spent years dedicating themselves to such a practice, one that bestowed rare privileges on those fortunate enough to have been trained in its ways, would not have wished to squander either that dedication or opportunity. The very craft that enabled Taliesin to travel across the Welsh kingdoms was also the cause and the final destination of his journey. The famed Urien, king of Rheged, would become the object of his Awen-infused attention. When Taliesin left, it's doubtful he went alone. The shifting boundaries of tribal territories, the persistent raids and skirmishes, the collapsing of some kingdoms and the expansion of others, sometimes within a matter of a few years, would have made the journey north a difficult one to judge. If Cynan's gifts were real, Taliesin could well afford to take some apprentices at least, as well as retain a few fighters, guides and fixers for the long journey. As they travelled north from Powys, they would have stayed within the band of Welsh territories that stretched from what's now the West Midlands and Cheshire up to present-day Lancashire and Cumbria, as far as the Solway Firth and perhaps further. Cynan's court was at Pengwern, present-day Shrewsbury, and an old Roman road headed north from the stronghold to the ancient walled city of Diva Vitrix, or Chester as it's known today. In Taliesin's time, this was still an active stronghold held by the descendants of the Romano-British, and being only a few days' ride north, it was probably the most obvious destination to head to first. They would have passed either directly through or close by Chester, fording the Dyfrdwy River, the waters of the Holy One, somewhere to the south of the walled city. From there, Taliesin may have followed the western coast, a route long used by Celts and Romans alike, turning north with the seashore and only coming inland again as the Ribble estuary pressed them eastwards towards the crossing at Preston. There were several Christian settlements in the area, and being a member of the new faith, Taliesin would have visited some of the more important establishments. He may have paid his respects at the Matrona Shrine, an ancient pagan stone altar once dedicated to the earlier mother goddesses, then appropriated by the Christians and rededicated instead to the great Christian mother goddess, Mary. The Welsh nobility inherited their Christianity from their Romano-British ancestors, who would have had little choice but to conform to the late empire's religious and social norms. Of course, that conformity would have ranged from mere token gestures to full adoption of the new faith. We can guess that the more dogmatic elements of the Celtic Church were probably restricted to the upper classes still resident in the old urban centres, while the further one travelled from the places of political power, the balance of spiritual power shifted back to the older paganism. According to at least one medieval writer, in the Rheged of Taliesin's day, many among the mountains were given to idolatry or ignorant of divine law, suggesting Taliesin wasn't always travelling amongst fellow Christians. Neither are we totally clear what type of Christianity was popular amongst the Welsh nobility. It was certainly a flavour of Roman Catholicism, but early Welsh Christianity also had its own uniquely Celtic perspectives, including several that were heretical on the continent. What blend of Christian and pagan beliefs was most pervasive is impossible to judge. In the historical Taliesin's poetry, some mention is made of the Christian God, but little else to suggest how much of the native paganism had been adapted to fit the relatively new Christianity. After crossing the Ribble, Taliesin would have headed north through the forests and fens, aiming for the ruined Roman fortress of Calunium on the River Lune, present-day Lancaster. Lune probably commemorates an original Welsh name that could have been Llawn, giving Afon Llawn, the abundant river in Taliesin's time. After crossing the Lune and following the Roman road for a while, the tops of the Lake District would have appeared on the northwestern horizon, and the more rounded humps of the Yorkshire Dales in the northeast. Somewhere between the two ranges, his path left the low forests and started climbing to the moors. At some of the higher points, Ynys Manaw would have appeared on the western horizon, a mysterious island in the Irish Sea that was, as far as Taliesin had heard, a real place. As he left the higher ground, he would have descended into the Eden Vale, a long strip of land surrounded by a long horseshoe of mountains, open to the north at present-day Carlisle. To the southeast of what is now the town of Penrith, a Welsh name, probably meaning Red Hill, Taliesin would have entered the territory of Llwyfenydd, the home of the king of Rheged, the great Urien. As he approached his final destination, he would have seen a large thatched roof hall sat in the middle of a timber stronghold. The place would have been busy with fighters, traders and cowherders, encouraging the lowing beasts into the pens. The first official to greet him was probably the Penteili, the chief of retinue, who oversaw the court's business at home and acted as a first captain in war. The court may well have been forewarned of Taliesin's arrival, the young bard wishing to make as big a splash as possible from the outset. His initial success depended upon impressing his new hosts and assuring them he was a bard of the highest quality and status. 8 of the 12 historical poems that have come down to us are addressed directly to Urien, and Sir Ifor Williams assume they could be arranged in some chronological order. It appears to have been composed on the occasion of Urien's successful defence of his northern border at a place called Gwen Ystrad, which either means Blessed Valley or Gwen's Valley, Gwen being a man's name here, specifically at a ford. Rivers created natural boundaries between territories, and battles were often fought at river crossings. So much so that the combat at the ford became a popular motif in many traditional literatures, Welsh Bardic poetry being only one of them. The attackers were probably Pictish warriors on horseback, and Taliesin accompanied Urien and his retinue to bear witness to the fight. Urien was, of course, victorious, or Taliesin's career may well have been cut rather short. On his return, with a successful warband, Taliesin may have taken a few days to compose his poem in celebration of Urien's victory. The warriors of Rheged gather in the thatch-roofed hall, where a large hearth fire burns. Urien sits in a prominent position. He has long, flowing white hair and beard, and his body is covered with many battle scars. The hall is busy with the chatter and merrymaking of his retinue and their families. Ale and mead flows, and valuable gifts and food are shared amongst the crowd. Taliesin comes to the fire, and everyone grows quiet. He begins his poem with a greeting to the retinue and proclaiming Urien's prowess as a battle leader, victorious raider and scourge of his enemies. Then Taliesin testifies to what has taken place. Like waves that cry out grievously over meadows, I saw hosts of brave men, and after morning's battle, bruised flesh. I saw a whole host of dead foreigners, a lively and fierce shout was heard. Enduring grief and exhausted soldiers were seen as Gwenystrad was saved. In the gap at the ford, I saw stained men dropping their weapons before the grey-haired warrior, craving peace. These went as slaves with their crossed white hands on the ford's gravel. This type of poem accomplishes a few things. It shows that Taliesin can perform a basic function for Urien. He's a reliable witness that can confirm the devastating supremacy of his lord. Taliesin saw with his own eyes how the war chief beat the enemy and defended his territory, proving that he truly was a man worthy of being king. The poem, declaimed publicly before the assembled retinue, would have also been a moment of pride for those fighters, an authoritative witness testifying to their aggression and bravery. They also would have understood that their glorious victory had been laid down in the collective memory, forever preserved in the oral tradition of the ancient bards. Of course, it was the skill with which Taliesin crafted his words, the elegance and artistry of his composition, which ensured the memory was enshrined. A dull reporting of events would not have endured the night, never mind a millennium and a half. Having proven himself to Urien and his court, Taliesin would have been given patronage for his poem and its performance. This confirmed his position and would have been a tacit invitation for him to continue his work. It's possible that Taliesin taught some apprentices this poem in praise of Rheged's king. There may also have been professional declaimers who frequented the court, performers who weren't bards in their own right, but committed to memory important poems and songs that people wanted to hear. In this way, Taliesin's poem may have travelled well beyond Urien's stronghold, becoming part of the oral culture of the region and propaganda for the king. In another poem to Urien, Taliesin gives more general praise. Urien of Erechwydd, most generous man, you give myriad gifts to the men of the world. As you hoard, so you scatter. The poets of the nations rejoice for your life's duration. Joy is made great by such a famed hero, glory made greater by Urien and his children, and he a leader, an exalted chief king, traveller's patron, first in the battle horde. The English know them and speak of them. They are death and disappointments. Urien's men burned their lands and stole their arms. Frequent losses, hard suffering, and no relief from Urien Rheged. Rheged's defender, famous lord, nation's anchor, I favour you, having heard of you. Although impossible to convey in translation, When reading the original Welsh text, it's clear that Taliesin was a very skilled poet, suggesting the Welsh Bardic tradition he was trained in was already ancient in the 6th century. This poem tells us about the relationship between Taliesin and Urien, between bard and king. In the last 2 lines, I favour you, having heard of you, Taliesin claims that because of Urien's fame as a great war chief, he has chosen freely to come and praise him. In other words, Taliesin declares he has some independence of opinion, that he can choose who he wants to celebrate. This claim to some kind of objectivity, to truly judge the worthiness of a king and patron, was an important part of how Taliesin presented himself publicly. In other poems, Taliesin's personality is a little more apparent. My courage asks, O great labour, shall I tell you what I see to be true? I saw before the Lord, he did not see me, every favourite boldly giving his message. I saw this Easter an abundance of produce. I saw leaves coming forth as always. I saw a branch of unrivalled flowers. I saw a Lord most generous in morals. I saw the leader of Catraeth over the meadows. May he be my prince, others fear him. As payment for my song, his gifts will be great, chief of men who gifts me a large herd. My awen is an ash spear, my shield from the Lord is my fresh, bright smile. Here, Taliesin is comparing his role as a bard to Urien's role as a warrior. Where Urien has an ash spear and a shield, Taliesin has his awen and a bright smile. The Taliesin we find in this very early poetry is bold, direct, and possesses powerful speech. He has a certain machismo and mystique, 2 of the key characteristics of his later legendary figure. This historical Taliesin is also proud and full of grace, passionate and bright. Again, attributes we can easily find in the legendary bard of later myth and folklore. Taliesin's style became part of the rhetoric of Welsh Bardic poetry for the next millennium. Ensuing generations of Welsh bards found that emulating Taliesin's attitude and personality was conducive to a successful career at court. This was probably a major factor in his ascension to the position of legendary founding father of the Bardic tradition. That the historical Taliesin claims awen as the chief weapon in his Bardic arsenal suggests the central role it clearly played in Bardic culture. If the awen of the 6th century was as profound a spiritual power as that of later periods, then it was not an offhand statement by Taliesin. He was showing the king his licence, metaphorically, to practice as a court bard. In later centuries, we see the bards organised into guilds that jealously guarded the poetic craft that gave shape to their awen, a craft that enabled them to produce such elegant and artful verse. They claimed their unique ability to use such a divine source of inspiration set them apart from common buskers and wandering minstrels, lower-class performers they sought to muscle out of the noble halls, lest they take the patronage the bards believed was rightfully theirs. Taliesin appears to have been dedicated to Urien's cause for some time, but he may also have travelled to other Welsh kingdoms to praise other great war chiefs. Amongst the 12 historical poems to have survived, there are 2 composed for a gwallog, probably the ruler of the neighbouring kingdom of Elfed, situated to the southeast of Rheged in present-day Leeds and Sheffield. The major threats to Elfed came from the kingdoms of Dera to the east and Mercia to the south, Angles and Saxons respectively. But Gwallog appears to have been a significant warlord, keeping these dangerous enemies at bay and even forming an alliance with his distant relation Urien and other Welsh kings to take on the increasing power of the Angles. In one poem, Taliesin lists Gwallog's many victories, including A battle by the sea, hearty praise for him, tormenting the men of York. A battle in Bro Bretruin with the heat of great fire, stout his hatred. A battle by the fortresses of Tekion, 100 battalions quaking in Euron. The battalions of Euron would have been Urien's men, said here to be quaking out of fear of the great Gwallog. In the second praise poem, Taliesin recounts how Urien gave hostages to the king of Elved, implying subservience. In this case, Taliesin's fame and the desire of declaimers to spread his poetry far and wide did not serve the bard well. Urien may well have gotten wind of the glorious praises heaped upon Gwallog, and as a result, his own portrayal as a grovelling failure. Being bested by his neighbour was not how Urien wished to be remembered. It appears Taliesin got wind of Urien's displeasure and sought to patch things up with a dadolwch, a type of poem designed to reconcile the bard with an estranged or an offended patron. The most excellent ruler I'll not abandon. I approach Urien, to him I will sing. When I am in anguish, I will find a welcome. It is the best of regions under the chief of rulers. I care little for the princes I see. I won't go to them. I'll not be with them. I'll go to the north, to great kings. Even though I ask for much, I'd bet a lot more. Without needing to boast, Urien will not refuse me. Lands of Llwyfenydd, mine their riches, mine their joy, mine their gains, mine their garments, mine their luxuries. Mead from cups and endless goods from the best king, most generous with his praise. The kings of all peoples are slaves to you. Before you they moan, they must be on their guard. And while I may joke around with the old man, there was none better before I knew him. Now I see how much I receive, but for God supreme I will not renounce him. Your kingly sons, most generous of men, will sing their songs in their enemies' lands. And until I am feeble with age, and in grievous need of death, I will not be joyful unless I praise Urien. It's unclear if this dadolwch was enough to appease the old king. With no way of knowing the actual chronology of these historical poems, we can only really guess if Taliesin was truly reconciled with Urien. If so, it's unlikely things were ever the same again. The society in which they lived placed a high price on honour, and to be shamed could be a fate worse than death. Perhaps the old war chief was mature enough to realise a great bard like Taliesin, a poet who appeared to be welcome at the courts of several Welsh kings, could provide a unique service to those who could afford it. Even in the crude terms of propaganda, his praise poems furnished his patrons with a powerful reputation. But perhaps Urien also understood implicitly that the Welsh bards were the only ones who could ensure a king's reputation truly survived his death. Only they could enshrine the memory of a mortal man and ensure he was remembered as an immortal hero. Mythologizing the nobility in this way was one of the most powerful services they could sell to their patrons. Especially in times of great violence, such as the period Taliesin and Urien both lived through, the brutal limitations of a warrior's life were ever apparent. To be blessed by Owen in a public commemoration, elegantly wrought in the chiming sounds of beautiful bardic poetry, must have seemed like a boon more precious even than the spoils of war. Reputation and fame are amongst the very few things the dead can keep. All of this is implied in the elegy Taliesin composed in commemoration of Urien's son, Owain. The soul of Owain ab Urien, consider, Lord, its need. A king beneath Rheged's green kingdom, it's not hard to sing his praise. the famed one in a low cell, his dawn-winged spear burning. For there is no equal to bright Llwyfennydd's lord, enemy's reaper, firm grip, bold as his father, as his grandfather. When Owain killed Llamddwyn, it was no more than sleeping. Now Lloegr's vast warband sleep, with light in their eyes. Those who retreated little were braver than was needed. Owain in fury punished them, like a wolf hunting sheep. Fine man, his weapons mottled, gave horses to those who asked. Riches like a miser he hoarded. He shared them for the sake of his soul, the soul of Owain ab Urien. Later bards believed this to be the finest elegy ever composed in the Welsh language. I must admit to feeling like I've mangled something precious in translating it, but at least it gives the bare meaning of one of the most famous poems in Welsh literature. In creating such a work, Taliesin kept his promise to ensure the heroic reputation of Urien's son down the ages. Had he not been able to keep that promise, you would not be listening to this poem right now. In Taliesin's poems for Urien, there are three prominent characters: Taliesin himself, Urien, and his son Owain. The implication being he was the natural heir to his father's kingdom. It was tragically common that the sons of the warrior elite perished before their fathers, and as we have no elegy for Urien, the end of Owain's life may have marked a slow but sure unwinding of Urien's power. The mercurial Taliesin may have seen the deterioration of the kingdom as inevitable, and left before the collapse accelerated. According to the 9th century Latin history Historia Britonum, which also contains the earliest reference to Taliesin, Urien was finally assassinated by another Welsh king in the year 590 CE. And whilst he was on an expedition, he was murdered at the instance of Morgant out of envy, because he possessed so much superiority over all the kings in military science. We don't know what happened to Taliesin after leaving Urien's court for the last time. As the wave of Angles and Saxons continued to gnaw away at the Welsh kingdoms of the Old North, Taliesin may have left for the relative safety of present-day mid-Wales, perhaps returning home to a more peaceful but less glorious career. Overlooking the Dyfi estuary, where on a clear day the translucent Isle of Enlli can be seen shimmering out in the Irish Sea, there is a burial mound that bears the name Bedd Taliesin, Taliesin's grave. It sits above the small village of Tre Taliesin, Taliesin's town. It's disputed exactly how old these names are, but they tell us that there is at least a folk memory of this being the last resting place of Taliesin ben Beirdd, chief bard of the West.